The wind rolled across the desert like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of dust, mesquite, and something ancient that clung to the red earth. The sun was sinking low, bleeding across the sky in streaks of fire, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to the oath that had been spoken earlier that day. An Apache warrior, proud and unyielding, stood before his people and sworn with a voice steady as stone that he would make the pale-skinned woman his wife. It was a vow that would echo far beyond that moment, binding not just to hearts, but to worlds that had never learned how to share peace. He was no stranger to blood, to hardship, or to the lonely path of duty. His life had been shaped by the jagged edges of survival, each battle scar a reminder of the price demanded by honor. Yet when his dark eyes first fell upon her, something had shifted inside him. She was unlike the women of his people, unlike the ones who rode fearlessly with the warriors or tended the fires at dusk. Her face held the softness of riverside lilies, and her voice carried the timid tremor of one who had been sheltered too long. But there was a courage beneath it, quiet yet unyielding, as if her spirit refused to bow, though the world pressed hard against her. The land around them was harsh, unforgiving, and it mirrored the tension that stretched between their two lives. She had come from a place where polished boots clicked on wooden floors, where the smell of bread drifted from ovens at dawn, where Sundays meant hymns rising from whitewashed churches. He had come from mountains and valleys, from camps that moved with the seasons, from a world where loyalty to kin was stronger than iron, and where every sunrise might demand a man's last breath. They should have remained strangers, separated by mistrust and the old bitterness between their people. Yet fate, with its cruel patience, had set them on the same road. No one could deny the moment when the warrior declared his promise. The firelight had glowed on his skin, casting long shadows across the circle of his people, and the woman had stood still at his side, caught between fear and some new feeling she could not yet name. The old men had whispered among themselves, remembering wars fought and lost, treaties broken like twigs beneath a heavy boot. The women had glanced at her with eyes sharp as arrows, measuring whether she was worthy to take a place among them. But the warrior's voice carried over them all, strong, unshaken, as he claimed her for his future. In that moment, she felt the weight of the vow settle over her like a blanket both warm and suffocating. She had not asked for this path, yet there was no turning from it now. His hand had rested gently, almost protectively on her arm, and she realized she had been marked by a destiny larger than her own choices. The life she had known, with its quiet mornings and safe routines, was gone, had stretched a horizon she could not yet imagine, filled with uncertainty and danger, but also with the promise of something powerful, something she had never touched before. The people in her town had warned her against him. They had told stories of raids, of shadows moving at night, of lives torn apart by men who rode like wolves across the plains. They said she would be lost if she followed him, that she would find only sorrow in the arms of someone born of the wild. Yet she had seen more in his eyes than violence. She had seen discipline, loyalty, and a strange tenderness hidden beneath the hard planes of his face. When perhaps against her own reason, she had let herself believe there was more truth in what her heart whispered than in the fearful voices that tried to chain her to safety. The wedding had not been the kind she once dreamed of as a girl. There were no church bells, no ribbons or lace, no family gathered to bless the union. Instead, there was the endless sky, the sweep of mountains rising like sentinels, and the solemn chant of prayers spoken in a language she barely understood. She stood beside him, her hands trembling, though she tried to steady them, and felt the fire of the ritual burn into her memory. For the first time, she was not a daughter obeying her kin, not a girl being told what she must do. She was a woman, stepping into the unknown, tied to a man who had sworn to make her his. Yet behind the boldness of his vow, behind the pride that lifted his chin, there was a storm brewing. For the Apache warrior carried his own burden of doubt. He knew the eyes of his people lingered on him with suspicion, questioning whether love for an outsider could weaken his spirit, whether his choice would dishonor the ancestors who had fought and bled for their way of life. And he knew the whispers of her kin painted him as a captor rather than a husband, a thief of futures rather than a giver of them. To claim her was to claim a battle greater than any he had fought with bow or blade. The days that followed blurred with preparation, with journeys across hard country, with nights spent under stars that burned bright and cold. She She struggled to match his stride, to hide her fear from him, to prove to herself that she belonged in a world so different from her own. At times she caught him watching her, his expression unreadable, as if he weighed every step she took and measured whether her courage would hold. And though he did not speak of it, she sensed he feared not her weakness, but his own fear that the tenderness she drew from him might soften the warrior's edge he had spent his whole life sharpening. Their union was not yet sealed in the way of man and wife, for the time had not come. But it hung over them, unspoken yet near, like the thunder that rumbles before a storm breaks. He had promised her openly, and she had walked beside him willingly, yet there were truths neither of them had voiced. She carried a secret within her, one that would shape the days to come in ways neither could predict. On the evening when they reached the place that was to mark the beginning of their life together, the air was thick with expectation. A small fire crackled between them, its smoke curling into the darkening sky. The warrior sat across from her, silent, his gaze fixed on the flames. His hands, so steady in battle, now fidgeted against his knees, as though restless with thoughts he could not speak aloud. She lowered her eyes, heart pounding, for she knew the moment was near when vows would no longer be words, but a binding of flesh and soul. Yet as he looked at her, something in her stillness unsettled him. There was innocence in her gaze, a purity untouched by the world's cruelties, and it struck him with unexpected force. He had sworn before all to make her his wife, but in that fire-lit pause as he saw her unguarded truth, the certainty of his path faltered. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, though her pulse raced like a bird beating against its cage. And it was then, in that quiet space between promise and fulfillment, that the warrior realized he was standing at the edge of a truth that would change everything. What he discovered that night would not only test the bond between them, but would ignite questions he had never dared to ask himself. The flames snapped, the wind stirred, and the world seemed to hold its breath as he leaned closer, caught between desire, duty, and the startling revelation that his new wife was not what he had believed her to be. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the worry that had gathered there. She kept her eyes low, afraid to meet the steady weight of his gaze. The warrior sat still, but inside he was not at peace. His oath had been spoken, his claim made before all, yet something about her presence unsettled him more than any enemy he had faced in battle. She was his now, his wife in name and in promise, yet she seemed untouched by the world's harshness, as if some fragile part of her spirit had never been touched at all. That innocence was not weakness, but it was foreign to him. He had known struggle, loss, and betrayal. To see her look at him with quiet trust forced him to question what he had drawn her into. She felt the silence stretch heavy between them. The crackle of the flames was the only sound, broken now and then by the wind sighing through the canyon. Her thoughts were tangled, a knot she could not loosen. She had followed him willingly, though her family had begged her not to. She had left behind everything she knew, choosing instead to step into a life she could not imagine. Yet here at the edge of this new beginning, she wondered if she was strong enough to walk the road he had set before her. She thought of her father, stern and bitter, who had once warned her that people like him could never be trusted. She thought of her mother, quiet and weary, who had only pressed a rosary into her hand before turning away with tears in her eyes. Their voices haunted her, filling her heart with doubt, yet she also remembered the first time she had seen the warrior. He had been unlike any man she had known, proud, steady, carrying himself with the weight of someone who bore responsibility not just for himself but for all who walked beside him. Something in his presence had made her believe there was a different kind of truth beyond what her people had always taught her. But belief was not enough to quiet fear. She did not know if she could truly be the wife he expected her to be. She had never belonged in his world, and though he had sworn she would, her heart whispered that belonging was not so easily won. The warrior studied her from across the fire. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the way her hands tightened together in her lap, the way she avoided looking directly at him. He had taken many vows before, vows to fight, vows to protect, vows to honor the ancestors who guided his steps. This vow, however, was unlike any other. This vow bound him to her, a woman whose blood carried the history of those who had taken so much from his people. To claim her was to walk a dangerous path, yet he had chosen it with full heart. What he had not expected was the quiet storm now rising within him, stirred not by her resistance but by her vulnerability. That night, sleep did not come easily to either of them. She lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering what lay ahead, while he stared at the stars through the opening of their shelter. Asking questions he had never dared to voice aloud, he wondered if the ancestors judged him for the choice he had made, or if perhaps they had led him to this moment for reasons he did not yet understand. He wondered if love of such a word even had a place in his life, could be strong enough to bridge the gulf between their worlds. The days that followed were long and demanding. They traveled across country, where the sun burned hot by day and the cold cut sharp at night. She struggled to match his endurance, her body unused to such hardship, yet she refused to complain. Each step she took was heavy, but she carried it with a determination that surprised him. Sometimes he slowed his pace for her, though he never admitted it. He told himself it was not weakness to let her catch her breath, but wisdom, for she was no longer just a companion. She was his wife, and her survival was tied to his own honor. She watched him as they traveled, spoke little, but his actions revealed more than words. He rose before dawn to scout the land ahead, his movements swift and silent as a shadow. He hunted with skill, providing food with a precision that showed years of discipline. When the wind turned bitter, he gave her his blanket without hesitation, yet there was also a distance in him, as if part of his soul remained closed to her, hidden behind walls she could not reach. She wondered if he would ever let her truly see who he was beneath the mask of a warrior. As they journeyed deeper into Apache lands, the eyes of others fell on her with suspicion. Villages watched their arrival with silence, the people measuring her with guarded stares, while children whispered. Women turned away and men studied her as though she were a threat wrapped in fragile skin. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing against her. Thunged, and though the warrior's presence shielded her from open hostility, she knew she was not welcomed. One evening, as they entered a small camp, an elder woman approached. Her hair was long and silver, her face carved by years of wind and hardship. She stood before the warrior, speaking words in a language the woman could not understand, but the tone carried both warning and sorrow. The warrior answered calmly, his voice respectful, but his body was tense. The woman at his side could only guess at what was being said, but she sensed the elder's message was clear. She was not one of them, and her presence would bring trials neither of them could yet see. Later that night, she asked him what the elder had said. For a long time he was silent, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. Finally, he told her that the elder believed their union would test not just them but the whole people, that old wounds between their worlds would not heal easily. She listened, her heart tightening, and though he tried to speak with reassurance, she could feel the heaviness in his voice. The promise of peace between them was fragile, and it could be broken with the smallest spark. Still, she did not turn back. She had made her choice, and whatever trials lay ahead, she would face them. She told herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep walking even when fear pressed hard against the chest. And though she often felt small in his world, she also felt a strange strength growing inside her, a strength born from the decision to stand beside him no matter the cost. The warrior saw that strength too. He watched her struggle yet refused to break, and it stirred something within him that he could not name. It was not the same as the loyalty of his brothers or the respect of his elders. It was different, sharper, deeper, more dangerous, for it made him question the path of a warrior, the path that demanded he always be hard, unbending, ready for the next fight. She made him wonder if there was more to life than survival and battle, if there was something worth fighting for beyond land and honor. Yet even as he wrestled with these thoughts, shadows moved at the edge of their journey. News traveled fast across the plains, and not all welcomed the union between him and the woman. Among his own people were those who muttered that he had betrayed their traditions, that to take her as his wife was to weaken their bloodline. Among her kin were whispers of anger that she had been stolen, that she had given herself to an enemy. The road ahead was not only uncertain, it was dangerous. On the night when the moon hung low and the air was thick with silence, he woke suddenly to the sound of distant footsteps. His instincts sharpened, his hand reaching for the weapon at his side. She stirred beside him, fear flashing in her eyes as she saw his body tense. He motioned for her to stay still, his voice low and steady, telling her not to be afraid. But in his heart, he knew the peace they had tried to build was already under threat. And as the shadows drew nearer, the firelight flickering against his face. She realized that their story was only beginning, and that the oath he had sworn would demand far more from them both than either had ever imagined. The night was quiet, except for the fire's steady crackle. But the warrior's instincts told him that quiet was a mask. He had grown up knowing how the land spoke, how the shift of wind, the silence of crickets, the faint scrape of stone against stone could reveal danger long before it appeared. That night, every sound sharpened until his senses burned with alertness. The woman at his side tried to calm her breathing, but her fear pulsed in the air between them. She had followed him this far, but she did not yet know what it meant to live with danger pressing close at every turn. The footsteps grew louder, moving with care but not careful enough. Whoever came was not skilled at hiding their presence from him. He rose silently, weapon ready, and moved toward the shadows. The woman clutched the blanket to her chest, watching him disappear into the darkness. For a moment she felt the loneliness of the desert swallow her, the thought striking her that if he did not return, she would be left alone in a world she did not understand. When he returned, his face was unreadable. He told her in few words that they were not alone. Strangers had been following them, men from her people, who did not trust the story of her marriage. They believed she had been taken against her will, and they meant to reclaim her, whether by force or persuasion. Her heart clenched at his words. She knew some from her town would never accept her choice, yet she had not imagined they would ride across the plains to take her back. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. He only told her to rest, though his eyes showed no rest would come to him that night. The next morning, they moved quickly. He guided her through narrow passes and along dry riverbeds where tracks would be harder to follow. His silence was heavy, but it was not anger she sensed, it was the weight of knowing they were hunted. She tried to keep up, though her legs ached and her breath burned, determined not to slow him down. She knew that if she faltered, she would become a burden in the fight he had not chosen, but could not avoid. As they traveled, she thought of the faces she might see among those who pursued them. Old neighbors, perhaps even kin, men who had known her since she was a child. To them, she would not be a wife who had made her choice. She would be a victim who needed to be saved. And if they found her, they would not listen to her voice, for in their eyes her will was already lost. The thought chilled her, for it meant that no matter what she said, no matter how she pleaded, her truth might never be believed. The warrior, too, carried burdens unspoken. Among his own people, whispers spread like wildfire. Some said he had broken with tradition, that he had weakened the bond between his tribe and their ancestors. Others argued that taking a wife from beyond their own bloodline could invite ruin. He felt the weight of their suspicion pressing on him each time they entered a camp. Though none dared to confront him outright, he knew the doubt in their eyes. To lead was to stand strong, but even leaders could not ignore the quiet erosion of trust. The woman noticed the distance growing around them. Children who once ran to greet her now kept their distance, urged back by mothers who watched with narrowed eyes. Warriors who had once shared fire with him now spoke only in curt nods. She felt herself shrinking under their gaze, knowing that to them she would always be the outsider, the one who did not belong. One evening, they came upon a river where the banks rose high and the water moved fast. The warrior paused there, scanning the land before speaking. He told her the river was both a shield and a danger. If they crossed, their pursuers might lose their trail, but the current was strong and unforgiving. She looked at the water with dread, but also with determination. If he said they must cross, she would follow, no matter her fear. They crossed at dawn, the icy water dragging at her limbs until she thought she would be swept away. His grip held her steady, pulling her forward step by step, until at last they reached the far bank. She collapsed onto the sand, shivering, but when she looked up and saw his eyes on her, she realized he had never doubted she would make it. That steadiness gave her strength she had not known she possessed. But the river had not solved all their troubles. The pursuers would not give up so easily. And beyond them lay the deeper conflict that neither of them could outrun. Their worlds were colliding, and they were caught at the heart of the storm. She wondered if love or even loyalty could endure when the weight of two peoples pressed down on them both. At the same time, within her heart, another struggle grew. She had always been told that purity was the mark of obedience, that to remain untouched until marriage was to honor her family and her faith. Now, married in a way the world she left behind did not recognize, she carried a secret she feared would one day wound him. He believed her choice had been bold, perhaps even reckless, but he did not yet know how untested she truly was. She feared that when the truth surfaced, it would change how he looked at her, how he measured her worth. The thought haunted her even more than the danger of the men who hunted them. The warrior had his own unspoken fears. He knew what was expected of him as a husband, yet he also knew that to force her into a life she was not ready for would dishonor them both. He had sworn to make her his wife, yet he had not sworn to break her spirit. His people would not understand such hesitation, but in the quiet hours when he watched her sleep, he felt a strange kind of respect that held him back. She was stronger than she appeared, but she was also fragile in ways he did not yet know how to protect. As the days passed, the conflict deepened. In one camp, an ambitious warrior approached him, questioning his judgment in front of others. The man's voice was sharp, filled with scorn, as he asked why a leader would tie himself to someone who could never truly be part of their people. The challenge was clear, and though the warrior did not strike, his silence was heavy with warning. Later that night, the woman asked him what the man had meant, and he told her in few words that respect was earned, not given, and that their union was a test not only for them but for all who watched. The woman felt the burden of that test pressing against her chest. She wanted to prove herself, to show that her heart was steady even if her hands sometimes trembled. She began to help more in the camps, carrying water, tending fires, learning words of their language. Some looked on her with suspicion still, but others softened, seeing her effort. Yet no matter how much she gave, she could not escape the truth that to many, she would always be the outsider who had taken their warrior's heart. And so the days stretched on, filled with both silence and unspoken fears. At night, when the fire burned low and the desert winds carried whispers across the sand, both of them lay awake, each lost in thought. She wondered if she had made a mistake leaving everything behind, and he wondered if the path he had chosen could ever bring peace. The footsteps of their pursuers did not fade. The whispers among his people did not quiet. The secret she carried did not lessen. Each thread of conflict pulled tighter, weaving around them like a net, until they could feel it pressing against their every step. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the moment was coming when choices would have to be made. Choices that would test not only their union, but the very meaning of the vow that bound them together. The nights grew heavier as they traveled deeper into Apache lands. Each fire they built felt smaller, each circle of light more fragile against the darkness that pressed close from every side. The woman often sat near the flames, staring into them as if she could read answers in the shifting coals. The warrior kept watch beyond the glow, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Neither spoke much. 4 words felt too weak against the weight of what surrounded them. The pursuit had not ended. At times the warrior would pause mid-step, kneeling to study the faint marks left in the dust. His silence told her enough. Men from her old world were still following, refusing to release the belief that she was captive. She longed to cry out that she had chosen this life, that no chains bound her. But the truth was clear. Her choice mattered little to men who carried rifles and believed they knew what was best for her. Tension also swelled within the Apache camps they passed. She felt it in the way the women pulled their children closer, in the way the men's eyes followed her when she walked with water jugs or tried to help with simple tasks. At night, she heard whispers, the rhythm of the language sharp and quick, though she could not understand the words. But she understood tone, and she understood the weight of suspicion. She had become a symbol of something far larger than herself, and symbols rarely earned forgiveness easily. One evening, after a long day of travel, the warrior led her into a canyon where the red stone walls rose like great towers. The echo of their footsteps lingered, amplifying every sound. She shivered as the shadows lengthened, and when they reached a narrow bend, he raised his hand for silence. She froze, watching him tilt his head slightly, his entire body still as stone. Then she heard it too, a faint sound of hooves striking rock. The clink of metal carried faintly on the wind. He pulled her close, his hand steady on her arm. His voice, low and firm, told her to stay hidden in the rocks. She obeyed, her breath shallow, as he moved forward into the canyon's curve. The waiting gnawed at her, the silence punctuated only by her own heartbeat. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before he returned, his jaw tight, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. He told her there were riders not far behind, and they carried the weapons of her people. That night, they did not light a fire. They rested in silence, pressed close against the stone, listening to the distant sounds of horses moving through the canyon. She curled beneath his arm, her body trembling, though she tried to stay still. For the first time, she wondered if their vow would cost them both their lives. The days grew harder. Sleep came less often, food was scarce, and every sound carried the threat of danger. She noticed the warrior's face had become sharper, more drawn, though he never spoke of weariness. His strength seemed endless, yet she knew the weight of carrying them both was pressing against him. At times she felt guilt gnawing inside her, wondering if her presence had brought ruin to him and his people. Yet when she looked at him, she also felt the quiet certainty that he would never have chosen another path, no matter the cost. But the pressure from his people did not fade. In one camp, an elder warrior confronted him openly. The man's voice carried across the circle as he accused the warrior of turning his back on tradition, of choosing a path that dishonored those who had come before. The woman sat frozen, every gaze in the camp heavy on her. The warrior stood firm, his reply steady, though his eyes burned. He declared that his vow was not weakness but strength, and that to abandon her would be to abandon his own word. The camp grew silent, but the silence was not approval. It was the silence of a wound deepening, one that could not easily be healed. That night, as they left the camp behind, the woman walked in silence beside him. Finally, she asked if he regretted the vow he had made. For a long time he did not answer, and she feared her question had angered him. But at last he told her that regret was for those who doubted themselves. And though he carried many burdens, he would not regret the choice to stand beside her. His words filled her with warmth, yet also with fear, for she knew his devotion could cost him everything. The land grew harsher as they traveled. Days of dust storms left their throats raw, and nights of bitter cold bit deep into their bones. Still they pressed on, both of them knowing that turning back was no longer possible. Each sunrise brought them closer to something inevitable, though neither could name what it was. She felt the tension coil tighter with each passing day, like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. One night, they stopped in a narrow valley. The warrior built only a small fire, enough for warmth but not enough to betray their position. They sat together, their shoulders touching, as silence stretched between them. She finally spoke of her fear that her people would never stop, that his people would never forgive, that they would both be trapped in a war neither wanted. He listened, his hand resting gently on hers, but his eyes never left the darkness beyond the fire. He told her that some battles could not be avoided, and that sometimes the path of honor led through fire before it reached peace. The sound of distant voices broke their stillness. Men calling to each other, faint but clear in the still night air. She felt her stomach tighten, fear clawing up her throat. He rose at once, dousing the fire, his body tense with readiness. She clutched his arm, her voice a whisper, asking if it was them. His nod was enough to tell her all she needed to know. They fled through the valley, the moonlight painting silver shadows across the rocks. The woman stumbled, but his grip kept her steady, pulling her forward. Behind them, the voices grew louder, closer, and soon the sound of hooves echoed against the stone. She tasted dust in her mouth, her chest burning as she ran. The warrior guided her toward a narrow ravine, urging her into its shelter. She pressed against the cold stone, her heart hammering as he stood ready at the entrance, weapon in hand. The sound of pursuit filled the night. She could hear men shouting, the clatter of hooves, the metallic click of rifles being readied. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. She watched the warrior's silhouette against the moonlit sky, steady and unyielding, and realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward. The men pursuing them had finally closed the distance. His people watched him with suspicion. Her people chased with conviction, and the secret she carried weighed heavier than ever. Canyon was about to explode with conflict, and there was no safe place left between the two worlds. The woman pressed her hand to her chest, her breath sharp and uneven as the shouts grew nearer. The warrior stood tall, his weapon raised, his body coiled with the strength of a man ready to fight not only for his life, but for the vow that bound him to her. The clash had not yet come, but it was close, so close she could feel it in the air, sharp as the edge of a blade. The night held its breath, and she with it, knowing that whatever happened next would decide not only their fate, but the fate of everything they had risked to be together. The night had stretched to its thinnest thread when the first rifle cracked against the canyon walls. The sound split the silence, a warning that there was no more running. The warrior stood in the mouth of the ravine, his body steady, his weapon poised, his figure outlined in the cold light of the moon. The woman crouched against the stone, her heart pounding so loud she thought the men outside might hear it. She wanted to cry out, to beg both sides to stop, but her voice was locked in her chest. This was not a battle of words. This was a battle of wills, and it had been written long before she and the warrior had found each other. The riders came into view, their horses restless, their faces tense with determination. They carried the look of men convinced of their righteousness. To them she was not a wife, but a girl stolen, a prize to be reclaimed. They shouted, their words echoing harshly through the canyon. They demanded her return. The warrior's reply was calm, his voice firm but not cruel. He told them she was his wife, that she had chosen her path. They did not believe. The standoff stretched as the night deepened. For a moment, the woman thought perhaps there would be blood, that one spark would ignite a fire none of them could stop. She pressed her forehead to the cold stone, praying for something, anything that would keep them from tearing each other apart. And then, something in her broke free. She stood, stepping into the open, where the moonlight struck her face. Her voice was trembling but clear as she spoke. She told the riders she was not a prisoner. She told them she was a wife, bound by her own will, and that no man had forced her hand. She begged them to see her truth, to let go of the story they carried. For a long moment, silence pressed heavy over the canyon. The riders shifted uneasily, their rifles still ready, their eyes fixed on her. They saw not the child they once knew, but a woman who had chosen a path beyond their reach. It was not the answer they wanted, and yet the certainty in her voice left no space for denial. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. Anger and sorrow still burned in their faces, but they turned their horses at last, fading back into the shadows of the land they had crossed to find her. When the last hoofbeat vanished into the distance, the woman felt her knees give way. The warrior caught her before she fell, holding her close as her body shook, whispered no words of triumph, only the quiet promise that he would never let her stand alone. In that moment, she knew their bond had faced its hardest trial and survived, though scars remained on both their hearts. The days that followed brought no easy peace. Among his people, whispers lingered. Some could not forgive him for choosing a wife from outside their bloodline. Yet others had seen her stand in the canyon, her courage breaking through fear, and they began to look at her with new eyes. She was still an outsider, but no longer one without a voice. Slowly, she earned small measures of respect, not with grand gestures, but with persistence. She carried water, gathered wood, learned their words, and showed each day that she was not a fleeting shadow, but a woman who had chosen to walk among them with strength and humility. The warrior, too, felt the change. He was no longer just the man who had sworn an oath. He was the man who had fought to keep it. His leadership, once questioned, now held new weight. He had stood against both enemies and kin for the sake of his vow. And though some still doubted, many began to see that his choice was not weakness, but the deepest kind of loyalty. Honor, he proved, was not bound by tradition alone, but by the courage to stand by one's word even when the world turned against it. The woman carried her own burden of truth. On the night of their marriage, when the fire burned low and the silence stretched between them, she finally confessed the secret that had weighed on her heart. She told him she had been untouched, that the life she left behind had never asked more of her than obedience. She feared he would see her as fragile, unworthy of the vow he had sworn so boldly, but when he looked at her, his eyes did not carry disappointment. Instead, they held a quiet respect, as if her honesty was a gift greater than any she could have offered. He told her that purity was not weakness, and that their bond would be built not on what the world expected, but on the truth they shared. Together, they carved a life in the harsh land. They learned to lean on each other, to face hardship not as two strangers from different worlds, but as partners bound by choice. She grew stronger, her hands no longer trembling when she worked, her voice steadier when she spoke. He, in turn, softened in ways he had not thought possible, finding strength not only in battle but in the quiet moments by the fire, in the laughter that sometimes slipped free despite the weight of the world, in the simple act of holding her close at the end of long days. But life in the desert was never easy. There were seasons of hunger, storms that tore through camps, losses that carved deep into the heart. Each trial tested them, yet each time they emerged with their bond stronger than before. She no longer doubted her place beside him, and he no longer questioned the vow he had made. What had begun as a promise in the firelight had grown into a life shaped by endurance, trust, and love born from shared struggle. In time, even her people ceased their pursuit. Stories drifted back to the towns of how she had stood in the canyon, how she had spoken her truth without fear. Some called her foolish, others stubborn, but all came to accept that she had made her choice. She was no longer theirs to claim. She belonged to no one but herself, and by her own will. She had given that self to the warrior who had sworn she would be his wife. The story of their union became more than just their own. It was spoken in whispers among the camps, a reminder that love could grow where distrust once lived, that loyalty could bridge even the widest of divides. Children listened, wide-eyed, to the tale of the night when an Apache warrior and a woman from another world stood against both friend and foe. Refusing to let go of the bond they had forged, the woman often thought of that night in the canyon, of the way the shadows had closed in, of the fear that had gripped her so tightly she could scarcely breathe. Yet she also remembered the strength that had risen in her voice, a strength she had not known she possessed until that moment. She carried that memory like a flame inside her, a reminder that courage was born not from the absence of fear, but from the choice to stand even when fear threatened to crush you. The warrior, too, carried his own reflections. He had fought many battles, faced enemies on fields of stone and sand, but none had demanded as much of him as the vow he had sworn. In her, he found not only a wife, but a partner who reminded him that honor was not carved in stone but shaped by the choices of the heart. Together they had walked through fire, and together they had emerged stronger. In the end, their story was not one of conquest or defeat, but of endurance. It was a story of two souls who refused to be divided by blood or history, who built a life on trust when the world told them it was impossible. Their journey had begun with suspicion, shadowed by pursuit, but it had led them to a truth larger than either of them alone, that love, when bound by loyalty and courage, could endure against even the harshest of deserts. And so, beneath the wide sky and the endless stars, the Apache warrior and the woman he had sworn would be his wife lived not in the shadow of fear, but in the light of the life they had chosen together. The land still carried echoes of struggle, the people still whispered, but their bond stood firm, unbroken. In their story lay a reflection for all who listened, that love is not given by the world, nor taken by it, but claimed and kept by those who dared to believe it is worth fighting for.